National Bank of Detroit, First Chicago, you name it. And back then, you know, it's common now, but back then it was unheard of, you know, for a company to be doing predictive modeling, householding, segmentation analysis on customers and target them using direct marketing. And so data warehousing and the internet started maturing in the mid-90s. And so Oracle became readily available. And so we were able to grow that division, and that company was sold to Dan Snyder, of the owner of the Redskins. So that was literally my first and last job. From there, I wanted to get my hands on some more enterprise-wide data warehouse solutions. So I worked for Capital One. Well, I consulted for Capital One for 2 years and worked under Rich and Nigel. They had an organization or a division called the Go Team. We were a growth opportunity. So we did a lot of enterprise-wide data warehousing solutions. Got a phone call one day and someone said, Jeff, who used to work for me, said, Jeff, what you did for banks are you interested in doing for governments? So in '97, I went and built a division in the data warehouse for the Department of Health for the state of Virginia, capturing data all the way down to the site level of individuals, their encounter, their activity justification, diagnosis, and the like. Word got out, and that was really the birth of VIA Consulting Group. Word got out that a small company, minority company did that, and then social services came knocking, did the same thing for social services, 121 counties, then education. Next thing you know, I was called to come and help with some work in Washington, D.C., in particular USAID. And that really started opening my eyes to the international development. Started doing work in anti-corruption in Haiti. Then I found myself in Madagascar dealing with child morbidity. It was in Madagascar where I was working with the World Bank, USAID, CDC, Comonix, and a host of others, and really started looking at how do we look at collaboration and leveraging technology to solve some of these bigger problems. And because of my background in data warehousing, being able to use mobile phone and big data and being able to make that from the ground level all the way up to the top and back down, it just started making a whole lot of sense. Now, fast forward that 20 years, later, we're still in a lot of, interesting situations, and very excited though, really. The last thing I'll say, Bobby, is actually through that experience, I built a global platform that really does a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today. We're on every continent except for India. We'll be in India this year. We're serving thousands of community, hundreds of thousands of people around food, education, transportation, healthcare, and a few others. So again, it's an honor to be here.
Great, thank you for that, and thank you for being our time. I'd like to introduce Darlene. Darlene, can you introduce yourself as well, and the topic is interesting.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and part of this important conversation. I was really excited that Bobby had indicated that this event was taking place, and I volunteered myself to be part of this conversation. In any case, I started my career actually as an economist, and as an economist, I work with a lot of data. And many years ago, when I started to program to compute, we used to use something called punch cards, and I really don't want to date myself with that. And then I gravitated toward healthcare, where I worked with some of the major research organizations in the area of psychiatry, emergency medicine, and behavioral health, and pediatrics. And one day I decided that I wanted to work in international development, and I was lucky enough to land at an institution and be able to morph my career in this field. And I was very excited about that work. And then one day someone came to me, and this was many years ago, and informed me that I was what they call a twofer. And for many of you who are not familiar with that language, a twofer is a woman and a person of color. And I was really shocked by that description of myself based on my qualifications. And that sort of stuck with me. And so when we talk about gender and race, I always wonder which which side do I land on? Am I speaking as a woman, or am I speaking as a person of color? So more broadly, you hear organizations want to talk about measurable impact and how they want to drive their programs to sustainable development. And both diversity and inclusion and technology, I think, are key vehicles to help countries both domestically and internationally transcend and help to improve the access, quality, and timeliness of healthcare, because that's my background. But one of the things that I found is that organizations, especially in this in this environment and more recently, were always comfortable talking about gender. Indeed, there were programs that were specifically geared toward gender discussion. There were gender strategies. And I always wondered to myself why we weren't comfortable talking about race and equality. And so I argue that you can't talk about one without talking about the other, because they very much go hand in hand. And so there are a number of mechanisms that, you know, we can take as individuals and organizationally to have those conversations. And I think this panel is indeed a start to have some very difficult and important conversations. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Darlene. It was very helpful. So, Carolyn, if you can introduce yourself and just a little bit about the, the creation of digital technologies and inclusiveness, that would be fantastic.
Great, thanks, Bobby, and thanks for the invitation to join as a panelist. It's really great, even though it is a little late here on the Philippines side. We're about 12 hours ahead, so so apologies if it's 11:30 at night. But Carolyn Flory, I work at the International Race Research Institute, which is a scientific research organization that focuses on the research to development continuum. I'm the technology for development lead, thinking about the use of digital agriculture here, specific to rice production and the rice value chain. I worked in Washington, D.C. for about 12 years before moving out to the Philippines. I worked for a lot of organizations that people would be familiar with, the USAID, the World Bank, United Nations Foundation, Inter-American Development Bank. And my focus has always been on digital technology and its application in different sectors. So working in digital health, women's access to technology, donor collaboration around digital development, social entrepreneurship, innovation. And this topic and why I'm really excited to join this conversation and excited that it's happening is for both personal and professional reasons, as a woman of color in the international development space, but then also in the digital development space, and recognizing that technology can be a great equalizer, but it can also exacerbate existing tensions and divides within societies. And I think that's one of the areas that I'm most passionate about, and would love to dig in with this group as well. And so how can we make sure that groups that already face inequities and inequalities and disadvantages in the countries that we work in, they're not further pushed into the marginalized parts of those societies. And I also just wanted to mention, it's been really interesting having moved from Washington, D.C. and being in the center of it all of the digital development conversations out to the Philippines. And the focus on inclusion or not, or understanding who the user is that we actually are trying to work with. And how we can make sure that we're actually co-creating instead of just sort of helicoptering in and delivering, quote unquote solutions. Because my former position, I was with the Digital Impact Alliance and was helping to steward the principles for digital development. So I always have very front and center, understand the existing ecosystem, design with the user, and not just assume that we know what's best in the countries that we're working in. So it's been a great learning over the past 3 years being here. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Bobby.
Great, thank you. That was really good. I'm definitely going to follow up on a number of questions there. And then I'd like to introduce Lyndon. And, Lyndon, definitely if you can mention a bit about the, generational differences, but, is there an economic and, investment impact towards the racial social justice side of things, because you've got a great background So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. First of all, I'd like to say, of course, good morning to some, good evening to some, depending where you are. I'm so very happy to be here. I'm so very happy to be standing on the shoulders of giants that have really dedicated their careers and their lives to creating social impact and creating social change. A little bit about me. I'm a recent graduate of North Carolina Central University, which is a historical Black college and university in the United States. There I studied computer science and business. I was actually pretty much on a little bit of accelerated path. I finished a traditional high school in 2 years, finished college in 3 years. So in many instances, like a little bit out of the age bracket in many rooms. So I'm used to being in rooms like this and advocating for my generation. But I think that it's work that's important. In terms of like what I did a lot of ecosystem development. So I was really focused on bridging the gap between African-American entrepreneurs and really this amazing world of Silicon Valley, right? And I know Jeff has a lot to talk about this topic as well, but we think about these models of entrepreneurship and we think that the Silicon Valley model or the Denver model works for everywhere, right? And we even try to take that and put that abroad. But what I think is really interesting about social entrepreneurship and what I think is really interesting about building inclusive ecosystems is that you're empowering people with the ability to build the enterprises that'll solve their problems, right? And in particular, giving them the ownership over those enterprises to solve their problems. So that is why when I'm talking about entrepreneurship, I focus really on the vein of social entrepreneurship. And I see that as a vehicle to pair with technology, right? Inclusive technology, open source development, in order to push forward social justice initiatives, right? We're talking a lot about how technology really can be this platform for equalization, and it can be. But we do walk this careful line, especially when we're talking about international development of technology being used as an entrenching mechanism, right? To create this virtual barrier to entry using big data, like using AI, like something that an average person can't just crack open their laptop and, boot up an AI, right? You need a quantum chip to do that, some et cetera, crazy stuff that Google has that I don't have on my computer, right? So I think that is really important, and what I really have dedicated my burgeoning career to is creating access and equity and investment inside those technologies, particularly around the axes of social justice and innovation. And I know, Bobby, as you were mentioning before, I'm wrapping up here a little bit, but yeah, when we're talking about investment in particular, right, we have this emphasis on the investor class, right? And I think we need to also think about crowdsourcing. We need to think about alternate mechanisms of fundraising that actually bring the power back to the entrepreneurs and the producers and the creators, especially in the realm of international development and also here at home as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you. That was really interesting, and I'll definitely come back to that comment. So, what I wanted to follow up with you, Jeff, was with regards to entrepreneurship and going out on your own, starting your own company. Is it important, in terms of the diversity in the field of digital technology, 5-10 years from now? Is it important for people of color to be at the table, to have their own tech companies? Everyone can create code now, right? Everyone can create data and AI tools and ML tools. So, but following that path to Silicon Valley is always difficult. So if you can just talk a little bit about, should, do you recommend for, the next generation of women, of people of color to follow the corporate path or create their own? I just want to dig a little bit more about what you had mentioned earlier.
Sure. Thanks, Bobby. I think the Silicon Valley model works. It's kind of like real estate development. If you want to be in the business of flipping homes, I think the Silicon Valley model will work. If you want to build a piece of technology and then be bought and sell the company, it's a great model. But if you're really looking to start, looking at social impact in various areas, I think that's where it starts breaking down. And this is not really a ding on anyone's motives or anything or their heart. It's really the model. So it's not a question of motives or message. The model just doesn't work. And I'll give you an example. So when we were here in Georgia doing the HITECH Act came out, and so we were working with a lot of electronic health record vendors, and I can mention all of them. I talked to all of them. And so while we were getting 5,000 doctors across the state of Georgia on EHRs, these vendors some of them had this conflict. One is that they were really beholden to their shareholders, and rightfully so, right? So they had to get a return on their investment. But then on the other hand, when you start dealing with population health, interoperability, the sharing of data, in the room, it made a whole lot of sense. But from a business perspective, it did not. And so what I saw was these EHR vendors were they saw that they were going to be just conduits if they did not move into the data play. And so, or the data space. So they ended up really started holding the communities hostage and the data hostage and would not share the data. And so again, that goes to my point where I think the Silicon Valley model works if you're probably wanting to, flip or sell your company. But if you really wanted to get down into social impact, whether nationally or internationally, I think there are other models, and Lyndon has spoken and really and hit on some of those.
Great. So let me just bring into the conversation both Carolyn and Lyndon to this. So as you talk about the Silicon Valley model, it means that there are people in the room who are providing funding, VC funding, equity, or even angel funding. And do people who look like themselves want to invest in themselves? So this question is: can we leverage technology to shift the power dynamics, right? Can we, help use technology and digital to really help marginalized and underserved communities, whether or not it's in Africa, the Philippines, and others, if we're in the room and part of the table, making the decisions. So, Carolyn, any perspective on, try to mobilizing the voices of people in tech at the local level, and then Lyndon, being at the table to being a decision maker, from the economic perspective. But Carolyn first.
Sure, thanks, Bobby. So I definitely think so. And I think I would actually go back to the principles for digital development as sort of a starting point for thinking about how we, in order to create inclusive technologies at a local level, it's really understanding who is and designing with the user of the technology that you're trying to create or that you think is the quote unquote solution, right? So I think that conversation starts internally as an international development organization. And I think there are some hard questions that have to be asked to say, are the teams that you're putting together, are they actually inclusive? Do you understand what the specific context and the needs are in the geographies that you're working in? So for me, I think, I was kind of shocked and excited for my classmates after graduate school. Some of them were getting jobs where all of a sudden they're sort of parachuting into countries that they had no historical context of. They didn't understand the socioeconomic, racial, anthropological, political, colonial histories, and then are expected to, sit with the Ministry of Finance or sit with the Ministry of ICT and come up with policy. And so those types of things are sometimes a bit disheartening, but I think that we have to look in the mirror too and say, am I the best positioned person to be collaborate, to be leading, or to be part of this team? Are there others who have, focusing on local organizations, focusing on local expertise, making sure that we're elevating those voices, I think is really critical, and leveraging those partnerships. So we're not trying to recreate something, so that we're not creating parallel systems, and really understanding, okay, who are we trying to, build this with, and really think about, okay, let's embody this do no harm principle, that we're not going to create something that's only going to further marginalize certain communities. But I'm sure Lyndon has a lot to say on that.
Go ahead, Lyndon, if you.
Yeah, Carolyn, first of all, amazing as always. I do want to say that I think that you're absolutely right? We have this, to lack of a better phrase, like white savior mentality, right? Especially here in America, right? It's just like, we're going to come in and we're going to solve all of your problems, right? It's paternalist. Like, we know what's wrong. We know what's wrong in your community without knowing nothing about the background, without knowing anything about history, colonialism. We're going to come in and we're going to solve the issues, right? And I do think the model of partnering with the communities on the ground is something that's really interesting, right? and also that you may not be the right person to solve those problems. And that's a beautiful point. Like me and my background, I am working with Venture for America. With those who are not familiar with that organization, it was started by Andrew Yang, and it focuses particularly on some domestic development, which I think is an archetype that can be applied internationally as well. But what it looks at is like bringing in entrepreneurs, like you were saying, instead of going and working at these big organizations, actually working at local companies and bringing that brain power and empowering those decision makers on the ground to run better operations, right? So we're not coming in, we're not taking it over, we're not creating multiple pipelines, but we're partnering with what's on the ground and bringing in expertise to help them grow, right? And then on the note of like talking about the Silicon Valley model, right? I think that to Jeff's point, it does work, right? But the question of works for who, right? When you're looking at Silicon Valley, yeah, you have lots and lots of really rich people, but you also have lots of homeless people, right? You have this concentration of humongous wealth, but it's at the same time a concentration of large inequality. And what we don't want to create in international development is going to these countries and creating multiple Silicon Valleys, right? Where you have a very few people having lots of wealth and everyone else kind of just like being at the behest of the data collectors, being at the behest of the brokers and building these gatekeepers. So yeah.
That's great to hear. One other thing I wanted to interject is one of the other co-chairs has joined. Just want to make sure that Jamila, also give her a shout out to her that she's part of this, and you'll hear from her as well. But she's joined, so I just want to acknowledge, just fully acknowledge that as well.
Hey, Bobby, can I just say one, I know we got a lot more questions to go, but from an entrepreneur perspective, and I hear a lot, especially in international development, local and on the ground and community. But it's very interesting being an African American going into an international company, being a taxpayer here in America, using tax dollars that I paid, and when I go into a country, they're using our dollars, but oftentimes I don't feel welcomed in that country, right? To be a part of the co-creation of anything. So I find that very ironic that I'm an African American, right? Going to Africa sometimes, and I see USA on cars or whatever, or wherever, not just USA, but I see Americans, but then I look at my dollar, but I'm not a part of that. They want my mind, they want my money, they want our ideas and even our technology, but in often cases, they don't want me. So this model of co-creating and collaborating, I believe it really has to make dollars and cents. And it has to make dollars and cents on the front end, not on the back end.
Yeah, what is it like, Darlene? What is it like, Carolyn? What is it like for people of color who are in leadership, and tech positions to travel to Africa or to travel to these countries? If you can share a little bit of about that would be great, because again, there's another power dynamics that potentially could play a role. Go ahead, Darlene.
Yeah, Bobby. So my first trip to Africa was amazing. I thought, oh, now I've really found my connection with my ancestry. I'm home now. And when I started to engage with some of my colleagues and some of the in-country teams in deploying technology and capacity building training, I felt a tremendous amount of isolation because I am Black, but I'm not an African. And so most of the time, what I found was that some of our development partners would rather engage in what they perceived to be the power structure. And that power structure was not a Black person, or it wasn't a woman. And so though they really valued my participation, they valued my interest in their country, their inclination was to have a white counterpart lead the discussion for them to be engaged with, because their perception was that this was the real power, that because I'm a Black woman traveling to this country, it's not meaningful. I don't have the power and the authority to engage the change that's necessary.
Very, very powerful. Carolyn, anything to follow up before I move on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, I would also be interested in getting Darlene's perspective on sort of how that's changed through the trajectory of your career, right? So for me, I also, you know, I think I look young, but I looked young, especially when I had the start of my career. And that also worked against me, right? As a young woman, Asian American, going into rooms, I can't count the number of rooms that I've had meetings with government officials that I'm the only woman in the room for sure, and everyone's sort of waiting for, like, where's the white guy? When is he going to come in to, you know, have the lead start the meeting? And so my perspective and how I've engaged in those meetings and tried to assert myself has really changed over the course of my career. And now I feel like, okay, I'm just, you know, this is it. This is me. Let's talk. And I don't. But at the beginning, when I was younger, it was really difficult. And so I think that I'd be interested in Darlene's perspective on what would you tell someone that's early in their career, like as a woman of color, how do you enter those rooms? And
yeah, so unfortunately, I've been in the situation of being the one and only most of my education and career. I was trained as an economist, which wasn't common for women of color back in my day. So I remember the first time that I went to a board meeting back in the day. I was there to present, but my white male colleagues handed me a notepad and said, I guess you're here to take notes. And so those were some of my earlier experiences, that everyone assumed that I wasn't at the level that I actually was organizationally. How has that changed? I think now, you know, it's changed to some extent, Carolyn, but there's still those examples where I lead a technology team of software developers and programmers. My team's all white. And when I'm in the meeting and I start to, you know, direct my team, there's always a lot of shock that I'm the one that's actually leading and directing this team. And then the final point is, because there's probably so few of me in the position that I'm in international development, I often wonder, you know, is the organization, you know, giving me so much visibility because it sort of really shows that they're doing a great job and that they value diversity and they value gender? Or am I here solely on my credentials? And so there's always this balance as a woman in this field, particularly in technology, that you're trying to, you know, rectify or reconcile in your mind. Thanks.
Fascinating. Really, really, really powerful. You know, what we try to understand with both of those experiences is some change. Can we encourage tech companies, digital tech startups, right? So now we've got this next generation of people starting companies. We've got the old guard of current international development and tech companies. But can we encourage them to make changes, or not just doing good in the countries, but doing well by the employees as well? So I put that out there because you have the experience of many years of leading tech teams, but now there's this opportunity for new companies, new startups, new ideas, especially during this digital transformation that's occurring. Is there an opportunity, Lyndon? Is there an opportunity, to do good and do well from the beginning, so that way it becomes a model or example for others?
Yeah, I absolutely think there is, right? And I think that the buck begins with your dollar, right? I personally, and this is something that I've seen amongst my colleagues, and something that's I think is a generational snapshot. Over 70% of my generation cares who runs the company, how the workers are treated, and like what's the diversity and representation, right? So what that means, what that boils down to, is that people are willing to make financial decisions about based on the leadership and the impact that those companies have. So it's not enough for just a company to just care about the bottom line, right? That company also has to hire Black women and treat Black women well. That company also has to not abuse labor laws like across the world and use immigrant labor or use other forms of labor that they see as subsidized in order to produce cheaper products. And I fundamentally think that I have a little bit of hope, and I really mostly am a pessimist when it comes to things like this. But I do have hope that there is a future empowered by folks that really care about the things that they're consuming and where it comes from. And I think that that's where the buck begins, right? It's there. So I do think there's hope, and I think that hope lies in our individual decisions that we make, and even the decisions that our organizations make. So if you're partnering with a contractor, is there a Black contractor? Is there an Asian contractor? Is there another contractor other than a white male that can do that, right? And what that means is that changes the dynamic. People see people like them in power, and what that means is that it's not just one type of person making a decision. There's not one type of person that controls the purse strings and controls the future of the world. And I think that is generationally changing. And a lot of that is because of the work that you guys have done, right? That our generation is able to say, okay, well, yeah, now let's take it 10 times further. I know people call us crazy. And I mean, I think that what's kind of lost in the dialogue, it's easy to kind of look at every older generation looks at the younger generation. It's like, okay, you guys are just like, what are you guys doing? It's a little bit too far. But I think that fundamentally our beliefs are based off of a critique of the way that the system has operated, right? And the reason why people are in opposition to things as the way they've done is because as the way they've been done is because they haven't worked, right? What we need to do is to pull in refreshing ideas and expand our intellectual capacity for change and what that looks like. So yeah.
Very good, very powerful. Really appreciate that, because I'm being sensitized more and more to, but not just the generational differences, but the actions that we need to take forward. So I'm going to just go a little bit technical deep dive, because again, this is digital and we're all being transformed. So we're working on, Jeff, you're working on algorithms, you're working on big data, you're working on machine learning. Right, we're learning quantum computing. Is there bias in these algorithms? Is there bias in the data that are darker skinned people with darker skin more likely to have false positives? Are machine learning tools assigning women into roles based on gender because that's what it's learning? If you can talk a little bit about just the hardcore tech side. Or algorithms completely neutral, and and it's not their fault. Jeff, are you there? Sorry, I wanted to direct that question at you. It's big data.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Sorry.
Yes.
Big data and really artificial intelligence is no different than I like to think of a child growing up. A child, when a child is born, is very, very innocent and learns through their environment and folks that are helping to nurture and develop that child. And the same thing with AI. I mean, you have to give it some foundational training, almost like, training wheels. And then over time, it gets smart and starts teaching itself. But fundamentally, the data that it receives initially lays the foundation. So if we go back to the 80s and we look at, all of the arrests that were made during the 80s, and then use that data and feed it into AI, then more than likely, if police are using that today, it would give a picture that someone like myself driving a car would probably be doing it, especially if I was driving a certain kind of car, doing it illegally and probably have drugs, right? Even when we look at modern technology, I can't remember what company it was. They were doing some images and they were using the staff and the employees. And so when they had an image of a Black person, it came up as a monkey, right? And that was AI that did that, but someone had to train it, or either that data wasn't available to train it, or someone else fed that data into that machine, right? So I think that what has to happen is communities of color and of all colors are going to have to be manufacturers of data, and that data is going to have to be somehow incorporated into a broader pool to be able to make, if we're going to deal with artificial intelligence, there's going to have to be a governance model around that. Otherwise, we have two options, right? You can go with China and look at how China has really excelled in artificial intelligence, but how they're using it really from to export economics, right? And really keep a people group out, right? Or America can really be the thought leader, as well as other countries' thought leaders, in looking at how do we, you can leverage some of the best practices of China. They're really excelling in that, but how do we then use AI and big data and use all of the data that we're capturing, and how do we really collaborate and share to feed a system to do good in local communities? So I think AI and big data, Bobby, to really just get straight to the point, I think AI and big data has huge potential, and it's necessary with the massive amount of data and the big problems that we have. But, the contributors of that data is critical. And I'll end with this. Larry Ellison, I believe, said this 25 years ago: whoever owns the data owns the business. I like to say it this way: whoever owns the data owns the community.
Great. So we've got this big data, we got this AI, we got these tech companies that are, using data sets that don't necessarily look like them. So therefore it can have, introduce some bias. They all have conferences, right? So there's always a Google, a AI, a F5 for Facebook, a technology conference. And oftentimes those technology conferences in the big data, in the AI ML space, are men and guys talking to other men and guys. These are often called manels, right? All male panels, or manfrences, all male conferences. I'd like to, ask Carolyn, when you were at Dial and others, any techniques, any, thing that you observe about trying to be much more inclusive especially because many people make not excuses, but they say, hey, I can't find any experts in AI who are women or people of color, or I can't find any experts. And so that's why, my conference, they're not speaking. So, if you can talk a little bit about, gender conferences, technology, inclusiveness, that would be great.
All right, thanks, Bobby. So I think that there's at least been a bit more of a sensitization to it, though. Now working at a scientific organization, it seems like it's just manels all the time. And I think one of the strategies that I've seen, and I did it with Jamila in this panel actually as well, and I was on a diversity and inclusion panel a few weeks ago, and my first question to the organizers are there Black people of color on this panel? And if not, then they're prioritized. Like, I don't want to, the space needs to be, there needs to be a prioritization of who is having these conversations. And I think that's the question that men need to start asking. And so I know of, for example, a consulting firm who they have a list of women who every time they're asked to be in a panel, if there's only one woman or there's no women, they say, instead of me, this is the woman that you can talk to. This is my counterpart. It's at a different organization. You're not going to be able to talk about specifically what your organization or consulting firm is doing, but you're making sure that there's representation for other people, for women. And I've seen, having a back and forth with some of my colleagues on Twitter as well. We called out a manel, and our sister research organization actually pulled their speaker from it to say, okay, you can't participate in this type of conversation if it's not inclusive. And so I think that those things are really important and steps that men need to take as well. But I think the other piece of that, just kind of going back to what I was mentioning in the beginning, a lot of these conferences that you're mentioning, and now it's different because everything's virtual, but in the past, we're asking people to pay $300, $800 to attend these conferences. And if we're going to be truly inclusive, and we're going to have them in countries in the global south, then we have to make them accessible to people who live in those countries and who work at nonprofit organizations and will not be able to afford an $800 ticket. So how can we be thoughtful about those types of things as well? And now that we are all virtual, one of the things that has been encouraging is these conferences that are going at all hours of the day, so that people on my side of the world can participate and be part of these conversations as well. So I think the gender lens is something that's really critical, and something that is the first thing that I see, and I kind of have a tendency to call out friends and colleagues, including the director general of my organization. He was like, well, I can't help that I'm a white male. I'm like, no, you can't, but you could ask the question, who else is on my panel? That is something that you can do. So I think that we have to kind of push those conversations as well.
Excellent.
Bobby,
Excellent.
I wanted to
go ahead, Darlene, please.
If I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I am amazed by how many WANLs that I see, especially in the development space, where people are talking about, countries that are predominantly countries of color, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the panel is WANL. They're all white panels that are discussing or presenting or the topics not only around technology, but it's around healthcare. And there's no representation from a person of color, either an African American or an African. So MANLs exist, and there are also WANLs.
Yeah, and to that point, many organizations. Before I get to the next point that leverages both what Carolyn said and what Darlene said, I'm encouraging you, the participants, each of you, please submit your questions to the panel. So I know I've been asking a lot, but I know you have questions as well for them. So I want to give you an opportunity to ask and submit questions. And so again, just trying to keep this as a really open forum. But Darlene and Carolyn's point made me realize that if you have male-dominated panels in science and tech, especially, oftentimes the organizations themselves at the top, at the board level, or especially in tech and international development, also look similar as well. So I wanted to give my colleague, co-chair Jamila, an opportunity just to briefly talk or just contribute on that conversation. So Jamila, are you on?
I am. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Is it 12? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. That's a really great point. I was telling some of my colleagues, I just did a little research on my own, and I looked up the top 25 international development organizations in the US, those that get 80% of US aid funding. And we all know who they are. I worked for 4 of them before, work for one now. And I decided to dig a little deeper because I was seeing all of these Black Lives Matter, George Floyd solidarity statements come out. And I'm like, I work for y'all. That's not true. So I just started, I'm not talking about currently, in the past, and I did an Excel sheet. And I just did based off of visual, so it's a lot of flaws in my data, looking at the executive leadership team and the makeup of the board. And for these 25 organizations, there were, say, about 350 executives altogether when you add up all the board members and all the executives. And I put them into categories: Black women, Black male; white women, white male; non-Black women, person of color; non-Black male, person of color. And, I expected to see a disparity, but I was shocked, actually, when the numbers came through. And I don't have it on me, but when I looked at the total number of executives and the total number of visibly Black, and some people I Googled because was looking at them and they looked like they may have been multiracial, and was able to find stuff to, clarify for me. But it was out of the 300 plus, I think it was less than 16 that were Black, and majority of those were Black men. And I was like, oh, wow. And so that kind of astonished me from that point. Like, wow, we really have a endemic problem with race in our industry. And that's across the international development sector, no matter if it's a technology subsector, agriculture, whatever you want to do. So I think Lyndon, or maybe somebody made a point earlier, how can we do this work externally, working on equity and justice, if we don't even have it in our internal organizations? So we have a long way to go within development organizations to really have a true conversation with ourselves. And one thing that we need to remember is systems are made of people. Technology is designed by people. There's not some space force that is controlling all of us. At least I don't know, maybe there is, and we're blind and can't see the space force. And so in order for the systems to change, in order for any of that to change, it's gonna start with the self. So what can we do as our individual to start making those changes within ourselves? Because if we don't make those changes in ourselves, there's no way we're gonna be able to make that change externally. And there's no way we're gonna be able to make those equity changes. So one thing that I've been doing is like focusing with organizations on how do you start taking that self-change and that self-reflection? And then how do you start changing the people that you have to start increasing who you're working with, who you're hiring? Because I don't like to just focus on hiring, but also who are we working with to design these projects? So one of the things I'm really happy to say, like Mercy Corps, what we've been able to do is an HBCU pipeline program, where we have dedicated a certain percentage, a large percentage of our internships to just HBCU students. And we didn't create a new internship program. I said creating access is looking at what we have now, not something an additional that's gonna work for just 1 year. And so how do we start looking at ourselves in a different way? And then before I end, I wanna take it a step further. How do we not just always partner with UC Davis or Texas A&M or MIT? Because when you look at the amount of research money that USAID puts into organizations and institutions, HBCUs aren't even on the map when it comes to getting a percentage of that donor development dollars to be able to grow and expand. So Morehouse would never be able to compete against, Morehouse School of Medicine would never compete against Harvard for USAID funding if they can't get the opportunity and access to get in. So what I'm working on now is how are we creating this access, not just to take the brain, from HBCUs, but to really partner with them at, the fundamental level. And for Africa, how are we working with local organizations as well, local institutions, local research? Why are we always I turn down consultancies all the time. No, hire African. Here you go. I know one who's in Senegal. You can hire them right now. Here you go. These are opportunities. I think we have to come together as the industry and be able to do that. And then the last thing I'll just say is that I talk to a lot of people about living in America and understanding where we live. The US is very segregated. We all know that, right? Whether you're in DC or wherever. So you have to look into your own backgrounds. If I don't know another person of color, or if I don't know an Asian, I don't know this person, how am I gonna have that change?
It's the network. Yep.
So I'll stop, I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you. No, that was a great point. And I'll definitely follow up with that. I wanted to give, there's a couple of questions that came in. I can't read them, but if Chizzy can read them. And then I think, Jeff, you wanted to contribute as well. But I wanted to give Chizzy first to ask the question, and then a panel to respond, and then Jeff. Okay.
We have a few questions, and please don't be shy. We don't want to spend the entire 90 minutes talking at you all. So please feel free to pop in with questions. We have a question from Holly Hunter, aimed at Carolyn and Darlene, but open to the group in general. How has the virtualization of events changed access for people of color and women to the extent that it may have an impact on physical events when they resume? So how has the technology of webinars and Zoom perhaps created a bit more equality and the ability for people of color to attend these events? And then another question, which I think the speakers have touched on a bit, but may want to go into more detail regarding the experience that people of color have dealing with leadership in their company, how to avoid that experience going forward. I think this is from Christina B, and I think she was referencing Carolyn and Darlene's conversation about being questioned as leaders in their workspaces. So I think Carolyn or Darlene, feel free to jump in there, but also Lyndon and Jeff, if you have a perspective, please feel free to share as well.
So go ahead. We'll start with Jeff because he was waiting, and then we'll get the questions. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I definitely don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know what BIPOC is, but I will like to
African
piggyback
person of color.
okay. But yeah, I'll leave that to Darlene and really Carolyn. But if it's okay, Bobby, what Jamila was saying, if I can just chime in there. And
yeah, I know you wanted the Jamila follow-up. So yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot is, we're actually working on a project with Morehouse School of Medicine, Maharia, Charles Drew, and Howard University in Zambia, actually helping, in the HIV/AIDS project, and I think it's the largest of its kind, and as it relates to PEPFAR and HIV/AIDS initiative. And it's dealing with loss to follow-up. So there is a lot of progress, and quite honestly, they're leveraging our technology to do that. So to be able to see, 3 historical Black universities leveraging an African-American technology to help in Africa. I'm here in Atlanta and helping on the continent of Africa in Zambia, working with 4 health clinics, tracking, families and individuals with HIV/AIDS and bringing them back to the health clinic. That's just to me, that's a great indication of where we're going. We got a long way to go, but to Jamila's point, I think, I know when I first went to Africa 20 years ago, I was like, where is Morehouse? Even when I went back to my alma mater, I knew they weren't engaged on the continent at that time. So to see what Jamila's doing here in this panel, and Lyndon and Carolyn and Darlene, it's really encouraging for me to see how we're progressing, and the fact that we have 50 plus folks who were on this webinar. So that's very encouraging to me. So I just wanted to kind of slide that in there.
Thank you. And then Carolyn or Darlene, do you want to respond to the question?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first question was about how this current environment has led to more inclusivity. And I would like to say that, yeah, I think it has, and it has almost changed the dynamics a little bit. So, now we have webinars in my organization that includes, the entire team in some of our countries for which we work. And the other thing I think that's interesting that's happened is because we're not able to travel to these countries and, deliver the type of technical assistance that we've been able to do in the past, we've had to rely more on our counterparts within these countries to take a stronger leadership role. And so to some extent, I think it's been very empowering because, our reliance is more on them giving us information and vice versa. So I think the dynamics have changed, and I see that as a bright spot. About, do you want me to answer the second one, or do you want Carolyn to pipe in, and then we'll...
Let's see, Carolyn, are you there?
Yeah.
Just quickly, and this is not to criticize the timing of this particular webinar, but I actually haven't been participating in a lot of webinars because they take place for the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. And so I've missed a lot of them because I'm sleeping. So I think that that's also sort of an inclusivity type arrangement. But I know that there have been ones and what's encouraging are when there are webinars that are held twice, or there are events that are held at different times of the day. The Global Digital Development Forum was held over a series of 24 hours where you had keynote speakers from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then the West Coast and East Coast. So that's encouraging. The one thing that Darlene's comment just made me sort of think about as well is again going back to that equalizer or just exacerbating inequalities is that, we do a lot of training in my team, and it's really shed light on the inequalities within, a lot of them are in the Philippines right now. I mean, this is a country that has only 60% internet penetration. I have people colleagues that work for the government that I haven't been able to get in touch with for 3 months because they're using mobile data, so they can't download anything. It rained today, and so a lot of my conference calls just didn't work because people it's too much of spotty access. So when we've shifted did a lot of things virtually, who have we left out of those conversations? People were trying to train,
Great
farmers were
point.
trying to reach. So that's the only thing that I wanted to add there.
Great. Just checking, Chizzy, are there additional questions from the participants, from the audience?
We don't have any now, so I'll reiterate, don't be shy. But I did have a question that maybe is taking us a bit backwards, but I'm curious to hear the opinion. We're talking here about tech being an equalizer and how we can be more inclusive, both internally at our organizations and externally when we work with these groups. And something that I thought about, a group thought about, was prior to going to these places, to these countries to help, what is the conversation or the thought process around if this technology is needed or wanted? Is it more of we say, hey, in America we have this tech and it works, so we're going to just bring it to you, or is it a combination of we have an idea, we don't know if it's relevant, let's talk about it? So is it that the West pushes technology development onto communities, or is it more of a process in which the communities, the two groups, can kind of talk to determine what actually the need is and if tech is the best way or is the desired way to address the problem?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And from my perspective, since I work a lot in this field of deploying and implementing and scaling technology in LMICs, it's a mixed bag. And a lot of it is a function of how skilled the ministry might be or how strong the leadership is in country. So I've been in examples where we've come up with a great platform and we go and try to deploy it in a country and it fails miserably because we haven't done that type of homework to engage directly with the communities to which this intervention is to support. And then there are some countries that are very clear about how you will leverage or use technology within their country. And they have governance and protocols about how to do that. So I still think that both examples happen. And I think that's an area that we need to do a lot more work.
Excellent point. Lyndon?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think that there's a number of accesses in which that's really important. Your question, Chizzy. We often think about, we have to be careful not to think about technology as this solve all pill, right? Technology doesn't automatically replace morality or ethics. Technology doesn't automatically replace the work that needs to be done on the ground with the people. And often we have to remember that technology is a tool, and it's all about how it's utilized, right? That it can be utilized for positive impact. It can be utilized for, the same issues that we already are having, right? It can be used to monopolize power. It can be used to disenfranchise people in those communities. So I think it's all about the rollout. It's also about bringing people to the table and the development of that technology, which is a really big piece. Especially now in the digital world, you were touching on it before. We were saying, yeah, okay, the digital world make it easier for everyone to join. One, there's time issues, so everyone can't join. Two, everyone doesn't have the ability to understand the digital space. Like my grandmother, she can't call into a Zoom meeting like that. My dad still can't call into a Zoom meeting. So there's a lot of other discrepancies that are in place, and we run the risk of just forgetting that technology is not equally accessible to everyone. Even in the United States, there are places that you still don't have access to high quality internet, right? You still don't have access outside of the big cities or outside of the metropolitan areas to call inside of that. So we have to think about the social issues that are still at play. Technology is not a solve-all pill that just erases racism or inequality or sexism or name the problems that we experience in the world. Technology just can't erase those. We have to remember to keep those present, especially as developers. We think we're immune to these, and we're not, right? We're just not developing technology. We are contributors to a net in society. We have to remember our value and our responsibility.
Great. That's an important point. So I want to give Jamila an opportunity, but before, I just want to ask this question because it's related to tech and social, and it's around language and communication. So every field has its own way of communicating. So in tech, we say master-slave databases. We say blacklist, whitelist for websites. I'd like to ask the panel to just, talk about the way we communicate. Should that change? Should tech begin to instead of having a chairman of the board, just a chair person or just a chair. So whoever wants to take that, I want to give Jamila an opportunity, but important point of language and communication if someone wants to talk about that. Again, in the US, Redskins has been the big, conversation point, but in tech, there's these, terminology in use.
Yeah, I'll go. I think that you can slice a lot of different. You can put things in a lot of different categories and become divisive, right? I'm probably a senior citizen on this call, right? So we can easily say, hey, anybody over 40, and let's do something, they can't be included. So I think we got to be very careful when it comes to labeling. And so, especially as it comes to technology, but I really think for me, while I think Lyndon made the point that I think is critical. I mean, you can't pass a law to improve. You can try to guide morality, but you can't change a person's heart unless they want to be changed, right? And I really do believe that in society, you have some extremes on both ends, but most people are in the middle of the road, right? So I think some of it is education. We're living in a global economy, and technology is really a conduit. And so when I look at these terms, and I look at the question that you're asking, I think technology has allowed us to become more modernized, but it has not allowed us, we haven't really become maybe perhaps more civilized. So how do we become more civilized and not fool ourselves thinking that because we are advancing in technology that we're civil? So I think when it comes to education, we have to start educating one another and start interacting with one another and becoming civil, right? And really, I think that if we just listen to one another instead of coming in with an answer, there's just a jingle that I use to remind myself. Before I tell, I listen. And after I listen, I ask. And after I ask, I share and always show I care. So I think oftentimes in tech and international development, we come with a prescribed answer and solution, and we don't really care to listen. We don't even take the moment to ask. And I'll stop here, Bobby. I'm from Newark, New Jersey, born and raised. I thought when I got involved in international development, because I came out of poverty, that I could contribute to this issue called poverty, but I was never welcomed into that world called humanitarian aid. And now when we're bringing technology in it, it's no different.
Yeah,
even though, I'm sorry, I'll stop, but yeah, so.
Yes, great. So
and
I just
Bobby, we do have a question in the
Go ahead,
group
Tizzy. Yeah, please ask the question. And go ahead.
Yeah, so I apologize, Liz, if I pronounced your last name wrong. Liz Nurad. So her comment and question is that she noticed that a number of the panelists came into the ICT for development space later on in their career, maybe at the second or third wave of their career. And she knows that this may be due to the fact that the sector is relatively new. So her question is, how can we learn from your experience in this field and encourage a more diverse group to enter the space as both young people leaving college and starting their career, or people coming from private sector of areas to move into this space? So how can we encourage more diversity, more entry into the ICT for development space? Not directed at anyone in particular, but maybe those of you who moved into the space may want to give your 2 cents.
Yeah, I guess I could start. I moved to this space when the space was very, very young. And I think that what we can do on the individual level is to act as mentors to those who have interest in this field. And I do quite a bit of mentoring with women of all races and ages who are interested in this field. And I think the other thing that we can do is, I always, fortunately or unfortunately, try to present myself as an example for other women to, engage and show interest in this field, is, another, avenue that I use. And then, I think someone mentioned earlier that this field is becoming more inclusive. And back in the old day, you needed to be a computer scientist, you need to have a programming background. And now with the, rapid growth of technology, you may not necessarily have to come from those backgrounds. And so reaching out to people from varied backgrounds that can inform some of this work, I think is also a strategy.
Yeah. And I think I think people as a whole are asking permission to care. I think, we just got to stop asking permission to care. It's not illegal to care and come up with solutions to make a difference.
I want to add on to what Darlene said. So from the international development perspective, DevX put out an article, I don't know if you guys remember last year, of what does the future international development professional look like? And it doesn't look like any of us now, not in terms of looks, but actually job titles. And the top 3 jobs will be in data, technology, and monitoring and evaluation. So I think we're seeing the industry change now in terms of the roles that we're doing here in the US, especially in head offices versus what's happening in home offices. And a lot of those program positions are being pushed from the US back to from the home offices to the field. And so when they're looking at the expertise of, an expat or expertise of a development professional, the careers are in technology, big data, and monitoring and evaluation. So people who are trying to enter the industry, one thing I do whenever I talk to college students is like, these are the fields to get into. And like Darlene said, you don't have to be a computer scientist, even though it may help you a lot, or know the back end. But most of what I know I do is how do we use the data? I don't need to know how to produce it. I need to know how to use the data to bring change. So a lot of what we do, and Jeff, the work that we've done, together for years, he's developing the technology, inclusively, and I'm figuring out how do we use this technology to make a difference. So I think it's understanding that, technology, like Lyndon said, it is only a tool. Like the greatest technology that I remember, that I love to use is a pen and paper. Think about how that changed the world. So technology is a tool. You can have all the tech you want, and you're still not going to solve the issue unless you're using it as a tool to solve whatever that root issue. And sometimes technology doesn't have to be hard. It could just be having a meeting where you're bringing people together who've never come together before.
Great, thank you. So we're getting towards the closing minutes. So what I'd like to do is just give each of the panelists about 30 seconds each, just to give us their final thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to Paul to encourage us to do the survey. So if we can start with Jeff, just 30 seconds, final thoughts, just quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Well, really just want to thank everyone. As I said earlier, I'm very optimistic. I think all races, if we can come together and collaborate in technology. And I really wanted, to Jamila's point, I think we've moved out of technology. Technology is a conduit. It really is the data industry that we're in, and quickly moving towards social impact industry, where money and assets funds, pension funds are going to be directly tied to measurable outcomes. And that's just the future. And so I just encourage everyone to be involved in that.
Thank you. Darlene?
Yeah, so I think this was a great conversation. I think technology and international development are wonderful fields to pursue, but increasingly it's all about the data. And I think that's the message I want to send out to my young counterparts. Thanks.
Excellent. Carolyn?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. So I guess final thoughts for me, I love that these conversations are taking place. And again, especially because I've been living abroad for the past 2.5, 3 years, it's the conversations that I want to be a part of. And what I would really encourage everyone, and what I need to do in my own work, right, is how do we change that into tangible policy within the organizations that we're working with? How do we have these conversations? How do we make sure that our colleagues start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable? Like we have to talk about this, and we can't just talk about it in the context of what's happened in the past 5 months. It's what's happened in the past decades, and how do we move forward?
Excellent. Lyndon?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really want to leave us off on a note of understanding power and privilege, right? And understanding how, while you may feel as if as an individual you don't have the power to act or the power to make the change that you want to see, that power lies in the collective, right? That power lies in the community. And that's not something that's talked about enough. And I think that by leveraging your individual privilege and bringing that individual privilege to a collective and a community, you can see the change that you want to happen in the world. And on the last note of like data and privacy, I think that we also need to understand our relationship to our data and our privacy, right? And how that data shouldn't be controlled by a few folks. We need to think about solutions to how we can democratize the internet, return to open source development, and keep the power really in the individual person's hand and in the community's hands. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I appreciate and send strong thanks to each of the panelists. Paul, I'll just leave it to you for the last wrap up of the survey.
Yes, just wanted to again say thank you to everybody for their participation today. All the speakers, all the co-chairs, Bobby, Shizi, Jamila, Chris, for all of your fantastic support. I think this is a really fantastic and dynamic conversation about an extremely important topic that we will obviously continue to follow and continue to have conversations about it and have events about in the future. As I mentioned, the one we're having in 2 weeks from today. As Bobby was alluding to, we would really appreciate your feedback as we move forward. So if you could please fill out the link that my intern Seth posted in the chat box a few minutes ago. We would really appreciate your feedback in helping us develop our virtual programming as we move forward. It really helps us inform what we should be doing, whether it's from a topic standpoint or from a formatting standpoint. It really does help us. So we really do appreciate that. And with that, I will leave it at that for today. I'll also just mention too that the recording, if any of your colleagues are interested in rewatching this, it will be available on YouTube soon. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I will just wrap it up there and say thank you to everybody, and I hope you stay safe and healthy. We look forward to hopefully seeing you at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.